basically I'm following the tutorial that is on Linda, and I'm gonna amend it a little bit because some of it is wrong. But I'll show you guys what I'm talking about real quick. It's this one right here. It's pretty easy to follow. There's a couple things little tips and tricks that I learned while using this tutorial that maybe need to be put into consideration. But yeah, so it's a couple different steps. The main two parts of this tutorial that we're going through are working with the outer feathers and working with the inner feathers. And then this tutorial also comes with a couple of scripts. If you go to the exercise files, you can download this and grab the scripts out of that folder. And I'm going to show you like what they do, but these just speed up the process because, you know, there's like 20 feathers, so you don't want to repeat the process over and over again. But yeah, so that's the gist of what we're doing. So I'm first going to start off showing you with this model that's complete. This is the Mama Duck rig that we used for Wander, the senior film, if you've seen anything of it. It's the one with the really fuzzy ducklings. But yeah, so this one's a little bit more complicated than what I'm going to show you guys today because it took me a lot of time. So we're going to simplify it a little bit. But basically, it's got these FK controls for the wings, and they work just like a shoulder and elbow and wrist. And they'll turn like that. And then it's got these separate spread controls so that you can tweak the feathers as you want. Now, my animators wanted to have a lot more control over the feathers and less automatic spread. So what I'm going to be showing you guys is the automatic one. And then I'll tell you about how to make it more controllable. But it's all keyable still. So this has got a control here, here. It's got two here, another two here, and then one here. And those basically just work as rotations to spread the feathers out like this. And that's using a series of constraints and blending them between a couple of group nodes and the joints. So yeah, the one that I'm going to show you, you really only need this one, and one in the middle. But because the duck has a little bit wider of a spread, a wingspan, we added a couple of extra controls to that. But yeah, so that's the gist of it. It's got clavicle controls for the rotating it back, and then some set-driven keys to put it into a wing tuck, which is over here. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. We're just gonna go over that. So I got this model offline. He was pretty neat. I liked him a lot. I think he's super cute. And I already set up the arms, but I'm gonna tell you a little bit about those first. So again, it's basically clavicle, shoulder, elbow, wrist, and then it's got a tip joint to orient the wrist. You want to kind of follow the geometry. Hopefully your geometry has a little bit of bend to it. This one doesn't. If I turn on the wireframe, it's basically just straight out, but it does have a couple of edge loops where the bends would need to be. But if you look up the bird skeleton, and just look at, oh really?
I'll edit this out.
Is that all of them? There's one. There's one. So they've got this like sort of zigzaggedy way of their elbows bending. Here's a good one. So you kind of have to follow that. Yeah. So just come in here and look at that for joint placement and things like that. You want it to be in the middle of the geometry, not off to the side within the depth or anything. But yeah, here's a good one. So yeah, so that's what we have for that. We'll turn off the textures so we can see the actual geometry of the wings. All right, So then for your wing geometry, hopefully you will have the model done when you are given it. We had to do a lot of switching of geometry for this, so we had a lot of issues with pivot points of the feathers and where the joints were. We had the joints aligned with the feathers originally, and then we switched out the feather geometry, which is not good. So it's not as lined up as would be ideal. So hopefully your feather geometry is final and done, and ideally the pivot point is right on the tip, right here, which you're going to want to be penetrating within the wing geometry. So then you want your joints to rotate basically from the tip of the feather like they would in real life. Pretty straightforward there. And then you just build your feather joints off of these. So we're going to go through that a little bit. I'm going to hide this guy, and we're just going to snap the joints to the tips of the feathers. Let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll make 8 joints. And then we'll take each of these, and I think we can just match the transformations. Modify, match translations. Yep, and it'll snap right to the point where you want it to pivot from. We'll just do that for this group. And then this one. Okay. So, I guess I didn't need that last one. So, we've got our joints at the right pivot point, but we need them to be oriented correctly. So you're going to want to make their children at the end of it, about right here. So you can just use like a curve snap or point snap, depending on if you have a vertex or an edge here. But another thing to consider is, do you want to have bend in your actual feathers? And you can do that with multiple different ways. You can use deformers, or you can use blend shapes, or you can actually add in a couple of joints down the line of the feather. So with the mom rig, we had a wire deformer on the edge, just sort of running along here that you would move up and down to move it instead of, if I turn on the joints, oh, love that. So, hide the geo. So we just had one joint for each of these, and originally it was one joint per feather, and then we used a wire deformer to change the geometry. I think in hindsight, using more than one joint down the chain of the feather would probably be better, and I think that's actually what they do in the Linda tutorial. Maybe not. But yeah, so if you want, you can do it like this, and then to keep it more exact, use the insert joint tool to put to make sure it's all like in a straight line. And I'll show you that real quick. So we're gonna take this one, just name it, what was this, left wing? Something like that. So your naming conventions on your feather joints are probably going to be really long, because you're going to want to label them for like outer feather and inner feather, and whether it's the base or the tip or the middle. So they're going to get really long and ridiculous. I'll try and keep it simple. But you're going to want to make sure that you do that, because later on we're going to add some groups and do some constraints, and you want to know what you're connecting. So again, we'll take this and we'll take our joint tool, and we'll just snap it to the end of this. So right about there is probably good. And then take this and make it a child. And then we have a nice little joint. And we'll say this is the tip joint. Something like that. Okay, and then you can come in here and go under skeleton, insert joints. And I think you just click it along here and then just drag it out, and maybe you want it like right there, and then it stays nice and in the plane. And it's all straight and neat. And then come in and rename it. So then, if you take all these joints, you can have a nice little bend in your wings, which is nice. As far as controls go for that, I would probably do a master control that does bend for each section. Yeah, so we've got that one. And then we're going to make sure that's oriented correctly. So if you look at these guys, where are you? Turn on the axes for that. So they've got the primary axis is X. You probably want to match that as much as you can. So we're just going to give it the same. Turn those on. Primary axis X, secondary Y in X positive. Is that what I have? I think it is. Okay, so that moved my joints, which is, I think it just rotated them. Yeah, we'll do that. And then come in, probably want to zero this out. Over here, go into your attribute editor, take your tip joint, and just type 0 into all three of these. Also, it's very important that you do that for your wing tip joint, because you're going to be using the orientation and rotations from this to control your feathers. So making sure that your joints are frozen and they're oriented correctly is super duper important. So you want to make sure that that is all completely settled and working correctly before you go and attach them to the feathers. So then we'll go and do the same thing for all of these joints. I think I'm just going to do 3 of them to save some time. We'll just do like every other or something. Just hide that one. Okay. So again, curve snapping it to here, and then using the insert joint tool. Just kind of pull it out to somewhere in the middle. Yeah. So that's going to be like different for every feather where you want to put it, but probably if your feathers are all similar geo, then it'll be on the same edge loop probably. But yeah, so we'll label that. We'll just call that 2. Then again, you want to orient then. And come back. And one more. That looks good. Okay, so now we have a couple of joints and we have them all labeled correctly, but I haven't hooked them up to actually attach to the wing joints yet. This is because there's a couple different complexities of this wing setup. If you are wanting to follow the rigging tutorial on Linda, then you can go ahead and make them children of the appropriate arm joints. If not, which I would recommend you add group nodes above them and then leave the wing feathers free. So you're going to want maybe a constraint group on top of them and maybe even a set-driven key group. So like I said before, I use set-driven keys to do the wing fold position because it goes through a couple different poses. It makes it really easier for animators to be able to just slide it into that pose. So that's a group above the controls, above these controls. And then you do the set-driven keys on that group so that they can still keyframe the FK and then also just have like an easy slide to get it into that one pose. You're gonna want a similar thing for the feathers, in which you're gonna want to have the actual joints be free so that you can do with them what you need to. If you need to add something more complex or another feature that you would want them to be free for. So yeah, I would just add a group node. I didn't orient these. Add a group node at the top of every joint chain for each feather. So we're gonna do just the constraint groups for now. So you can just group them. So a really important thing with the groups on the feathers is your group is going to have a totally different pivot point. So you have to make sure you come in here and match the pivot points for each of these. So just click on the group and then click on the first joint and modify, match transforms, match pivots. Yeah. We'll just hit G to repeat. Yeah, so that should help out. The other thing is the orientation of the group is different. So you're gonna probably want to match up the orientation if you can, which can be kind of annoying, and I'm not really sure the best way to do that. It kind of depends on what you prefer. Sometimes I've just come in and done it manually by hitting D because it's been stubborn. We don't have to worry about that too much right now, but that may mess you up sometimes. Yeah, so we'll rename these groups. Control C. And we'll name this constraint group, using CONST for an abbreviation. We'll call it actually an ORCON group, Orient Constraint Group. You can use whatever naming conventions you use, but that's the one that I use. the reason I like to label my constraint groups is I'll label them like an orient constraint, or if I need like another constraint group that's a parent constraint on top of that, it's a lot easier for me to tell, because I as the rigger know what the orient constraint group is doing as opposed to what the parent constraint group is doing. So I'll name it like a parcon or an orcon, just so I can tell the difference and it's not just a constraint group. But again, naming conventions are up to you, but they are very useful. So now we have all of these beautiful, beautiful things, and these are what are going to be the children of the bones. So what we want to do is have this feather right here control the spread of these two. So this one is going to get a control, and this one is going to get a control. And then these two feathers are going to spread out between those. So you can do this with constraints. The Linda tutorial goes through doing it with blend color nodes, but if you do the groups on top of it, that's not going to work out as good. So I've just done it all with constraints. Yeah. So this first feather right here, we're going to make that a child of the tip joint, and then this feather we're going to make a child of the wrist joint, and then these two will also be children of the tip. Is that right? No. Hang on. Yeah, okay, I lied. So these two will be children of the wrist, and then this one will be, so we'll take this group and we will come in and attach it to the wing tip, that one, and we'll just hit P to parent it. And these three will be children of the wrist. Okay? Easy enough? Alright. So, when I move this, well, maybe. When I move this, it's going to move all those. And then we're going to add some controls. So you can do this. I did just like blocky squares around each feather, and that's kind of what they did here too. But you can make the controls look like whatever you want. Doesn't really matter. Yep. So we're just going to do some little circles for now, for the sake of making things easy. I'm going to take the control and orient it to the joint group. So you made the control, and then you're going to want to click on, where are you? The first joint, shift click. Well, maybe. Control click, shift click, whatever. And then parent it. So what I'm doing now is just orienting it to the group. So you parent it and then zero everything out, and then it's right there. You can scale it from here too. And then you're going to take it, group it, and then unparent the group. So Control G and then Shift P. So now I have this control with zero. Oh, it still has some rotations on it. I think I did that wrong. We'll try this again. Parent. Group it. Unparent. Oh, hang on. Skip step. Okay. So now I have a control that is zeroed out, but still has the correct orientation of the feather. And again, keeping the orientations and everything lined up is really, really important, because it'll really screw you up and make your life so much more difficult if you don't. If you do forget to do something like that, a lot of times you can fix it with an offset group. Just add a group node to whatever's not oriented correctly. So if you look at this outliner, this is kind of scary. There's a group node in between almost everything. And some of them have a group on top of a group on top of things, and different constraints on each of those groups. This one has 3 different group nodes before the joints, but empty groups can really help you out, guys, so keep that in mind. But hopefully you will be able to do everything right the first time, but that's not always the case. So I'm going to resize this real quick in component mode. Just hit F8 and then scale it down, and maybe turn it, squish it a little bit, draw it out. Alright, so this is a really ugly control, but let's say that's our control. And that's going to move this feather. So what we'll do is we'll name it left outer, if I can spell. I like to abbreviate feather because it's a long word, so FTHR, and then control. And then you can label your offset group. I've seen it labeled offset, I've seen it label orient group. It's whatever works best for you. I use offset. Okay, so we have our control, and we want to be able to control this feather with that. So right now it has this orient constraint group, and this one is going to need another group. So we'll add that in below the orient constraint group, and we'll call that the, well, it's kind of another orient constraint group, but we'll use a parent constraint, see how that works. Yeah, so depending on how you set yours up, you may have to switch around between parent and orient. You want the constraint blend that I'm going to show you here in a minute to be the orient constraint for sure, but depending on how you have things set up, you're going to want to change your control to your main feathers, be parent or orient. And you may have to mess with the hierarchy a little bit too. But, so it's a little bit of trial and error. So we're going to take this, the control, and, oh, I need to match the pivot points real quick. Again, very important that you match the pivot points, because that will definitely screw you up. Modify, match pivots. Okay. So now this and this match. And we're going to take the control, just the control, come back up to this, and we're going to constrain, parent. Go ahead and keep maintain offset off or on, because sometimes things get funky. I've kept it on, I like it. Hit apply, and now this guy will move him, but this thing moves separate. So we want this to probably be a child of this. So we'll take this offset group and remember to take the group, not the actual control, and make it a child of the other control. So now it moves. Ta-da! Alright, so then we're going to want another control on this one, and then those will work to spread the feathers out, and then they'll take these guys along with it. So we'll repeat the process for this feather. Make circle, parent it to U, 0 it out. Group it, unparent the group, and we'll name it. We'll call this one, what's the name of this feather? Call it that, and then okay. So we have that, and we'll resize it so it's not hideous. Don't make your controls in perspective view. Yeah, sometimes feathers can be really hard when they're at an angle like this. So we had this one modeled a lot more straight out. This one's still at a bit of an angle, but it's not quite as extreme. And then the one on the Linda tutorial is modeled more in like a T-pose, and the feathers go straight down. But he's more of an upright bird anyways. So if you have control or input in the model, that's ideal. And it can make a lot of this process easier. Does that even look remotely right? Sure. Close enough for now. Wow, that's really ugly. Okay, so then this guy is going to come to this joint, and again, add another group node. Nope. Control G. Okay, match the pivots. And take the control. And parent constrain it. Okay, so now you have control over you. But we want this one to stay put while this one, if you're turning this, you want the feathers to spread out automatically. So we're going to take this joint, put everything back to 0 first, this joint, and actually make this a child of this middle bone here. Which is going to look a little strange, I will admit. If I can get the right thing. There we go. make sure that's right. So now, when this rotates, this control group will be a child of this one. This will rotate, and it'll move all of them, right? But then this outer control, the wrist, will rotate and just move those. But then you still have control over the individual feathers, or at least those two individual. If you want to go real extra and at the end of all of this add tweak controls to each individual feather, again, that's why you leave these joints open so that there's groups on top of them moving, and then you can add controls on the actual joints or add another offset group. But yeah, so feathers can be very difficult to animate, and every pose is completely different. I have no idea how it works out in real life, but as far as animation goes, tweak controls can be very helpful. We've got a couple of them on this one over here. If we turn the geo back on. Nope, if I knew how to use Maya. I've got these little guys right here. These little circles. Can't seem to click on them. And they basically just move the feathers wherever. But it's because I left those groups to act as a buffer in between. Very helpful for last minute tweaks. Okay, so now we have these working like this. Does everyone know how constraints work? Okay, so basically they work as an influence over an object. So if you have more than one, you can blend those constraints, and you can have more than one object influencing a third one. And the Linda tutorial will go over this in really good explanation, probably better than I will. But basically, we want this joint and this joint to blend the orientations and like however much they're rotated between these two. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this one and this one the constraint parents of these two joints. And that's why we added these little groups up here, so that we don't have to do it on the actual bones. So what we're going to do is, now the script that I told you guys about will make this a lot easier and quicker for when you're doing like 80 feathers. So I'll just pull that up real quick and show you guys what it looks like, but I'll do it manually. Scripts. So it's called Constraint Blender, and this is what it looks like. What is it? Alt. Control. Yeah. Make that a little bit bigger so you guys can see it. The only thing that I would say with this script that you have to change is, it says parent constraint right here. Just change it to orient, because the parent constraint doesn't work as good for a more complex setup. So that's basically all that you have to do, and then you just select the three things in the right order, and it will tell you right here how to do that if you forget. But I will do it manually first. So we're going to select, let's see, yeah, so we're going to select the outer joint, the inner joint, and then the group for this one, orient constraint group. And then we're going to do constrain, orient, maintain offset, constrain all, apply. So now, whenever this one moves, that one will come with it. But maybe you want these to be spread out a little bit different, and you want one joint to have a little more influence. And that's definitely going to be the case when you have a lot of feathers. You want them to spread out evenly in how a bird actually works. And the 50-50 default blend on this is not going to do it. So once I do this one, I will show you exactly what I mean. So again, pick the two controls, and then the influence, which would be our orient constraint group. So constrain, orient. So down here, you have your constraint weight, and that's on both of them, okay? So what you want to do is basically you can make this, so you pull this out and see those will follow it, and then you can pull this out and they'll follow this. But what you want is this one to follow this more and this one to follow this more. So you can just fix that with the constraint weights, which is pretty nice. So we're going to come into this feather and say we want it to follow the outer joint 80% of the way and the inner joint 20% of the way. I do things in decimals because it's easier to keep track of percentages that way. If you just think of it as like out of 100 and they add up to 1, that's the easiest way I think to keep track of it. And then you can add like a master control somewhere where you basically add in, I think it's a reverse node, where you combine these into one blender slider, and you can do that for each of the feathers, and then the animator will have the ability to adjust it as they wish. We're not going to do that right now because that's a little bit extra work than we have time for. We are actually running out of time. So yeah. So that's going to blend these out. And then we'll come into this one and we'll say we want you to be 80% to the inner joint and 20% to the outer. And depending on your feathers and like the number of feathers, you're gonna change that. See, this doesn't quite look right, so we can maybe change this to like 60% and 40% to give it more of an even spread. And you have to just play around with that until you find one that works. Yeah, so that's a little bit more even, maybe for 4 feathers, as even as you're gonna get. But now it kind of spreads out how you would expect it to. Make sense? Cool. All right, what did I just do? All right, so we'll zero that back out. And then for these inner feathers, you would go through the same process and just make them spread between a control here and here. Does anyone want me to go through and repeat all that, or? Okay. So yeah, that's the basic gist of it. Just playing around with these constraint groups and parent, if you need to add in like a set-driven key group. I would recommend doing the set-driven key on a group node above these controls for the FK, so that you can give your animators an easy slide tuck. And then once you do that, from there you're going to want to adjust your feathers with, for birds, they have like this pocket inside their body that they tuck their wings into that is kind of difficult to create in a rig. So what you want to do is, for the tucked position, it's going to be nearly impossible to get your rig to do it on its own. So you're going to want to do it correctively with either set-driven keys or a blend shape, or I think that's about it. We did set-driven keys for ours. So we basically just took, again, come to the joints and then add in another group. And then this is your set-driven key group. So you'll name it like Control V. Oh, I lied to you. That's in the wrong place. No, it's not. Yeah, so you'll do it on the lowest part of the hierarchy, right above the joint, and name it an SDK group, set-driven key, SDK group. And then this is where you will do your set-driven keys, and you'll basically just place each feather where you want that. I think that's probably, it's a hassle, but I like that a lot better than doing a separate blend shape for each pose, because then you can just do a set driven key for each pose. You want about 4 poses to get into that tucked position. If you watch, you can look up reference, bird unfolding wings. And there's plenty of reference out there for what those different positions are going to be. And this is even simplified and animated. But if you look at maybe like a duck, which is what I looked at, see if I can find the video. They go through a couple different poses that aren't just straightforward. So you're going to want to pose those yourself because they're not quite straightforward. And see how the feathers kind of like flap and curl? That's what the extra joints are for. And then you'll use the clavicle to rotate it back into that position where they fold up like that. So again, see, there's the pocket. Yeah, so birds are pretty weird, and there's a lot of work that you got to put into making them be believable. But that's the start of it, and then you got yourself some wings.